At 1 minute past midnight on August 19th, 2026, a 50% tariff was supposed to slam into $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. It did not happen. 12 hours before that deadline, Donald Trump picked up the phone, called Mark Carney, and then went on Truth Social to say something almost nobody in Ottawa expected him to say that week. The tariffs were paused, and a deal, in his words, was already in hand, subject only to the finalization of documents. That single sentence, posted late on a Tuesday night, pulled the rug out from under a trade war that had been escalating for a year and a half. This is the story of how a 50% hammer aimed at Canadian cars, Canadian wine, and Canadian cheese got pulled back at the last possible hour, what Canada actually gave up to make that happen, and why the fight over trade between these two countries is nowhere near finished, no matter how the headlines read this week. To understand why that midnight deadline mattered so much, you have to go back to July 20th, 2026, a full month before the pause. That was the day Donald Trump sat down and signed 3 separate presidential proclamations, each one invoking a law almost nobody outside a trade lawyer's office had ever heard of. Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 is nearly a century old, and according to trade analysts, it had essentially never been used in modern times before this. It gives a sitting president the power to slap tariffs as high as 50% on any country the administration determines is discriminating against American commerce, without needing new legislation from Congress. Trump used it 3 times in one day, once for automobiles, once for alcoholic beverages, and once for dairy. Each proclamation targeted Canada specifically, and each one laid out, in surprisingly granular detail, exactly what the White House said Canada had done wrong. On dairy, the administration's own fact sheet accused Canada of giving European exporters duty-free access to cheese quotas that American producers were denied under equivalent trade commitments. On alcohol, the numbers were stark. According to the proclamation itself, American alcohol exports into Canada collapsed by roughly 81%, falling from about $718 million to just $137 million between March 2025 and February 2026. The reason wasn't a change in consumer taste, it was policy. Beginning in February and March of 2025, provincial and territorial liquor boards across nearly every part of Canada, with only Alberta and Saskatchewan eventually reversing course by June 2025, simply stopped buying and stocking American beer, wine, and spirits. It was a political statement dressed up as a procurement decision, and it worked exactly as intended in the sense that it hurt. On automobiles, the White House pointed to a 22% drop, worth about $5.6 billion, in Canadian purchases of American-built vehicles between April 2025 and March 2026, which officials attributed to a 25% retaliatory tariff Canada had placed on American vehicles, while leaving cars built in other countries untouched. Here's the detail that made these particular tariffs so dangerous for Canadian industry, and it's a detail a lot of casual news consumers missed. Unlike almost every other tariff fight in this trade war, these new 50% duties were written to apply regardless of whether the underlying goods qualified for preferential treatment under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the successor to NAFTA, that is supposed to guarantee largely tariff-free trade across the continent. USMCA has been the safety net that has shielded the vast majority of Canadian exports from the worst of this trade war since it began. These 3 proclamations were built specifically to override that safety net. Trade lawyers at firms tracking the filings noted that the product lists attached to the proclamations went far beyond wine, cheese, and cars. They included hockey sticks, cement, industrial textiles, refrigeration equipment, circuit boards, GPS devices, plastic packaging, and upholstered furniture. Only a handful of categories were carved out entirely: energy products, potash, fish, critical minerals, and anything already covered under a separate set of tariffs, known as Section 232 duties, that apply to steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber specifically. Those Section 232 tariffs are a different, older front in this same trade war, and they never went away even while this new 50% threat was building. To really grasp how we got to a near-miss deadline in August 2026, it helps to rewind even further to the spring of 2025, when Mark Carney was still new to the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa. Carney inherited a trade relationship that was already cracking. Trump had imposed tariffs earlier that year, citing concerns about fentanyl crossing the border, and Canada, under Carney's direction, responded with its own retaliatory measures rather than simply absorbing the hit. By July 2025, Trump escalated again, sending Carney a letter posted publicly to Truth Social, threatening a blanket 35% tariff on Canadian goods unless a deal was reached by a shifting deadline that moved from July 21 to August 1st. Carney's public posture through that period was consistent. Negotiate, but don't fold. He told reporters in Prince Edward Island that summer that talks had entered an intense phase, while simultaneously talking about diversifying Canada's trade relationships beyond the United States. Through the fall of 2025, the relationship seesawed between moments of apparent warmth, including an October Oval Office meeting where Trump told reporters Canadians would walk away very happy, and moments of real tension, including a threat that November of a full 100% tariff if Canada moved forward with a rumored trade arrangement with China involving electric vehicle tariff reductions. Canada's trade minister at the time flatly denied any pursuit of a free trade deal with Beijing, but the episode showed how quickly Trump was willing to escalate over even a hint of Canadian outreach to other markets. It's worth pausing on exactly how Mark Carney arrived in the Prime Minister's office in the first place, because it explains a lot about why his cautious tone on August 19th mattered so much to Canadians watching closely. Carney, a former central banker, was sworn in as Prime Minister on March 14, 2025, replacing Justin Trudeau, who had announced his resignation in January. At his swearing in, Carney didn't waste time on diplomatic softening. "We will never, ever, in any way, shape, or form be part of the United States," he said. "America is not Canada. We are very fundamentally a different country." That line was a direct response to a period in which Trump had repeatedly floated the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state, language Canadians overwhelmingly rejected, and that fueled a genuine surge in Canadian nationalism. Carney called a snap election just over a week later, on March 23, 2025, framing the vote to Canadians in stark terms. "President Trump wants to break us, so America can own us. We will not let that happen," he told a crowd in Gander, Newfoundland. The campaign that followed became known, informally, as an elbows-up election, a hockey reference borrowed to describe a posture of standing your ground against a bigger opponent. And it worked politically. A Liberal Party that had looked headed for a historic defeat before Trump's trade war began ended up winning the April 28, 2025 election, with Carney telling Trump directly in their first Oval Office meeting that Canada was not for sale, to which Trump notably replied only, "Never say never." That elbows-up framing followed Carney through the following 16 months, and it's exactly what made his relatively conciliatory posture through 2026 politically risky. Polling from the Angus Reid Institute conducted as this trade war dragged on found that a clear majority of Canadians, 63%, believed the country needed to take a hard line in negotiations and refuse difficult concessions, with roughly three-quarters of Liberal, NDP, and Bloc Québécois voters agreeing with that harder posture. Only a minority, 37% of Canadians overall, though a majority of Conservative voters specifically, favored a softer, more conciliatory approach. That polling data matters directly to this story because it means every time Carney picked up the phone to call Trump, or every time LeBlanc smiled next to Greer for a photo in Washington, there was a real domestic political cost being weighed against whatever economic relief a deal might bring. Carney was elected on a promise to stand up to Trump. Ending up as the Prime Minister who quietly asked provincial premiers to restock American liquor, even in exchange for tariff relief, was never going to be a politically free move, and that tension helps explain why his own language around this deal stayed so measured compared to Trump's declarations of total victory. By the time 2026 arrived, the underlying disputes over dairy quotas, alcohol procurement, and auto tariffs hadn't been resolved. They had simply been layered on top of each other year after year, threat after threat. That's the backdrop against which Trump signed those three Section 338 proclamations on July 20th, 2026. And because Section 338 requires a minimum 30-day notice period before new tariffs can take effect, the clock was set. August 19th, 2026, at 1 minute past midnight Eastern Time, was when a 50% tariff would hit unless something changed. Something did change, but not easily and not quietly. Through the first half of August, Canada's negotiating team was working almost around the clock. Dominic LeBlanc, the minister responsible for Canada-U, Trade, and Janice Charette, Canada's chief trade negotiator, spent repeated stretches in Washington meeting with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. According to reporting from the Globe and Mail, sourced to 5 people briefed on the discussions, Charette delivered a blunt warning to her American counterparts roughly a week before the deadline. She told them that if the White House actually let the 50% tariffs take effect on August 19th, it would represent what she called a cliff, a point of no return that risked halting the negotiations entirely. 4 of those sources said she specifically warned American officials that Ottawa would not be able to control the public reaction in Canada or the reaction from Canada's provincial premiers if that deadline passed without a deal. That's a significant detail because it tells you the Canadian side wasn't just worried about the economic damage of the tariffs themselves. They were worried about the political fallout making any future negotiation harder. That political dimension was very real. Premiers across the country, particularly in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, had made clear they controlled the alcohol shelf stocking decision. not the federal government, and they weren't going to lift the ban on American booze just to keep talks alive. One provincial government source told the Globe and Mail that American alcohol would only go back on shelves if there was significant, meaningful progress, specifically on the Section 232 tariffs, covering steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber. In other words, Ottawa's negotiators were trying to close a deal in Washington while managing a coalition of premiers back home who had their own red lines and their own leverage. As the clock ticked down toward the deadline, the tone from Ottawa shifted from routine diplomatic language to something more urgent. On Monday, August 17th, Prime Minister Carney described the negotiations to reporters in blunt terms. "We are negotiating," he said. "The negotiations are very intense and delicate. This is not the time to talk about negotiations in public." That same day, Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley, who has been vocal on the American side about protecting the broader trade relationship, told reporters that while tough negotiations were fine, they could not be used as a way of, in his words, destroying the trilateral trade agreement known as CUSMA. That comment mattered because CUSMA itself was already under separate strain. The United States had declined to renew the agreement the previous month, placing it into a mandatory annual review process rather than a fresh long-term commitment, adding yet another layer of uncertainty hanging over every conversation happening in Washington that week. On Monday, and again on Tuesday, Carney and Trump spoke directly by phone, according to statements from the Prime Minister's office, which declined to detail what was discussed beyond confirming the calls covered ongoing trade negotiations. Meanwhile, on the ground in Washington, LeBlanc and Charette sat down for nearly 2 hours with Greer and Lutnick on Monday. When Greer emerged from that meeting, he offered reporters almost nothing, responding no comment to shouted questions, though he did pause to wish a reporter from Radio Canada a good day in French. LeBlanc, speaking after his own meeting, kept his comments similarly guarded but signaled momentum. "We're going to continue working," he said. "Our job is not yet done." Then came Tuesday night, August 18th, and the moment that actually shifted the entire trajectory of this story. Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that he was pausing the 50% tariffs against Canada, which had been scheduled to take effect the following morning for a 3-day period. His stated reason was direct. Canada and the United States, subject to the finalization of documents, had reached a deal. In the same post, Trump floated something that immediately caught attention north of the border, suggesting the Keystone XL pipeline, a project canceled years earlier and long considered politically dead, may be awoken from the grave. That line alone generated its own wave of coverage completely separate from the tariff story, a reminder of how unpredictable this particular negotiation has been from the start. By Wednesday morning, August 19th, Trump was elaborating to reporters at the White House, touring construction projects on the grounds while talking to the press pool. "We had a very good conversation with the Prime Minister last night, and we've come to a deal with Canada," he said. "As you know, the 50% tariffs across the board were going on against Canada today." He described Canadian negotiators as having given the United States the points that we had to have, specifically citing market access for American agricultural products as a core win for his side. "And they called yesterday and they gave us the points that we had to have," Trump said, calling the outcome a very fair deal for both countries. On agriculture specifically, Trump was emphatic, saying Canadian tariffs on American farm exports would become non-existent. "The tariffs will be non-existent for our farmers," he told reporters. "Our farmers were paying tremendous tariffs into Canada, and those tariffs are going to be totally eviscerated down to zero." He also suggested some flexibility on the broader tariff structure Canada had been facing, saying, "We may bring some of the tariffs down to a level where other countries are, because Canada was paying a higher tariff." On the specific question of auto tariffs, a top priority for Ottawa's negotiators throughout, Trump was less precise, but still signaled movement. "We're doing certain things," he said, when asked directly whether U.S. tariffs on Canadian autos would come down. "We've got to give something. They were paying a high number. We're reducing it a little bit. It's good for everybody." At another point, he claimed, in characteristically sweeping terms, "Basically, we have no tariffs going into Canada anymore. Canada was charging us tremendous tariffs. We no longer have any tariffs." That particular claim was not independently verified and appears to significantly overstate the actual state of the agreement, which both governments themselves described as still being finalized. Carney's public response was notably more restrained than Trump's, and that contrast is itself part of the story. Rather than declaring total victory, Carney wrote on social media that Canada and the United States are now moving towards an agreement that reinforces that Canadian advantage, including by securing the best terms in each of Canada's most important strategic sectors and providing greater certainty about our future trading relationship. He publicly praised LeBlanc and Greer for what he called significant progress in the talks. In a separate statement, Carney struck a cautious note that stood in deliberate contrast to Trump's declarations of a done deal, saying that while the two countries had made substantial progress, there is important work still to be done. That single sentence from Carney is arguably the most important, least clickbait-friendly line in this entire story, because it's the clearest signal from the Canadian side that nothing was actually locked in yet. LeBlanc, for his part, posted on social media Wednesday that he had met again with Greer in Washington, and that both sides were working collaboratively towards a finalized agreement. Greer himself, speaking to reporters after emerging from that Wednesday meeting, expressed confidence without overpromising. While we certainly, I think, have eliminated some of the irritants that we've had over the past year, we also are taking a strong foot forward on the next steps, he said, according to CNBC. In a separate post on social media platform X, Greer wrote that the agreement would strengthen the broader North American economy, positioning the continent as what he called a manufacturing and energy powerhouse. A source with direct knowledge of some elements of the emerging agreement, speaking to the Canadian press on condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to discuss the terms publicly, confirmed that lower duties on steel and aluminum were part of the package, though that source could not say precisely how much the rate would change. Sources briefed on the negotiations also indicated that tariffs on Canadian autos specifically were on track to drop, alongside the steel and aluminum reductions, according to reporting from CBC News. Wednesday afternoon in Ottawa, Carney briefed both his federal cabinet and Canada's provincial premiers on where things stood. That's a critical moment, because, remember, the premiers were the ones holding the alcohol shelf leverage that Ottawa's own negotiators had flagged as a serious constraint just weeks earlier. According to Nova Scotia Premier Tim Houston, who spoke to reporters after that briefing, Carney asked all of the premiers to put American alcohol back on Canadian store shelves as the two countries worked toward finalizing the agreement. The reaction from premiers across the country was not uniform, and that lack of uniformity is worth sitting with for a moment because it undercuts any narrative that this was a clean, unambiguous win being celebrated coast to coast. British Columbia's David Eby said that while no agreement was going to deliver everything Canada was hoping for, the federal government had made substantial progress across strategic sectors. Saskatchewan's Scott Moe said he was hopeful the deal would meaningfully reduce American tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber, framing his comments around hope rather than confirmation. Quebec's premier, Christine Frechette, was the most guarded of the group, telling reporters it was simply too soon to render judgment on the deal, and that she needed considerably more information before deciding whether the outcome was actually positive for her province. A comment widely read as a reference to lingering concerns in Quebec over Canada's supply management system for dairy, a system this whole dispute originated from in the first place. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who had spent the preceding days publicly saying his province was prepared for any and every scenario, including the tariffs actually taking effect, had been pushing for what he repeatedly called a united Team Canada response to what he described as an attack on Canadian workers and Canadian sovereignty. By Thursday, August 20th, the picture had clarified only slightly and in some ways became more complicated. Trump had extended his own 3-day pause by shifting the effective deadline once again, this time to Saturday, giving negotiators until the weekend to actually finish the paperwork. LeBlanc headed back to Washington that morning for another round of meetings with Greer, this time scheduled at the office of the United States Trade Representative. Members of Carney's own advisory council on Canada-U.S. relations, who had been briefed on the emerging deal the night before, welcomed the pause in tariffs, but were candid that the underlying uncertainty was still actively harming Canadian businesses, deal or no deal. That's an important, sobering detail that got lost in a lot of the more triumphant headlines. A pause is not a resolution. A framework is not a signed agreement. And businesses making investment decisions, hiring decisions, and pricing decisions in places like Ottawa, Toronto, and across the American Midwest do not operate on Truth Social timelines. They operate on finalized legal text, which, as of Thursday, August 20th, still did not exist in public forum. It's also worth putting a finer point on why the CUSMA review process, sitting quietly in the background of this entire story, is such a live wire. CUSMA, the successor to NAFTA, was designed with a built-in review mechanism, giving each of the 3 member countries the chance every 6 years to decide whether to extend the agreement for another 16 years or trigger a more limited annual review process instead. The prior month, the United States chose not to renew CUSMA outright, pushing it instead into that annual review track, according to Al Jazeera's reporting on the broader dispute. That single procedural choice means the entire tariff structure protecting the vast majority of Canadian exports to the United States, the very structure this new 50% tariff was specifically designed to bypass, is now up for reconsideration on a rolling basis rather than locked in for years at a time. Trade experts and industry officials, cited in Al Jazeera's coverage of the original 50% tariff announcement, warned at the time that the dispute over autos, alcohol, and dairy could complicate those broader CUSMA negotiations, and that warning has aged accurately. Every sector-specific fight, this one over cars and cheese and wine, is now happening inside a larger, more uncertain negotiation over whether the foundational free trade agreement between these three countries survives in anything like its current form. The industries caught in the middle of all this have been remarkably exposed the entire time. Trade experts and industry officials warned as this fight was unfolding that the new tariffs specifically threatened job losses and business closures in vulnerable sectors including lumber, wine, and dairy, sectors where profit margins often can't absorb a 50% cost increase without either passing it directly to consumers or shutting down entirely. Canadian auto workers, represented by the union Unifor, had already gone on record during earlier rounds of this trade war, calling similar tariff actions unjustified, unwarranted, and illegal, language that captures just how existential these fights have felt to workers whose jobs depend directly on cross-border auto manufacturing supply chains that, in some cases, see a single vehicle part cross the Canada-U.S. border multiple times before final assembly. That's the human and economic backdrop against which every phone call between Carney and Trump, every meeting between LeBlanc and Greer in Washington, and every premier's press conference in provincial capitals across the country was actually happening. This was never simply an abstract diplomatic chess match. It was, and still is, a live economic threat to specific factories, specific dairy farms, and specific vineyards on both sides of the border, with real payrolls attached. So does the title of this video hold up? Did Mark Carney really flip the negotiation? And did Trump's 50% tariff threat really lose its power? The honest answer sits somewhere between the headline and the fine print. What actually happened is this: a hard, legally binding 30-day notice tariff deadline. One of the most aggressive tariff actions taken against Canada in the modern era of this trade relationship was averted at nearly the last possible hour through direct, repeated phone diplomacy between Carney and Trump, backed by weeks of grinding technical negotiation between LeBlanc, Charette, Greer, and Lutnick in Washington. That is a genuine, verifiable outcome, not a fabrication. Canada's negotiators appear to have secured real concessions, agricultural market access improvements that Trump himself called total elimination of tariffs on American farm goods flowing into Canada, and indications, though not yet confirmed rates, of reductions to the steel, aluminum, and auto tariffs that have weighed on Canadian industry for well over a year. Those are not nothing. In a trade relationship that has spent 18 months moving almost exclusively in the direction of more tariffs, more threats, and more retaliation, a credible pause plus a framework agreement with specific named concessions represents a real shift in momentum. In that narrower sense, yes, something flipped. But loses its power is a stronger claim than the facts on the ground fully support, at least as of this recording. The 50% tariff threat was paused, not repealed. Trump's own language left the door open to reviving it. He described the outcome as subject to finalization of documents, not as a completed legal instrument. Carney's own public statements were notably more hedged than Trump's, explicitly warning that important work remained. Canada's premiers, the very people whose cooperation Ottawa needs to fully unwind its own retaliatory measures, like the alcohol shelf bans, were split between cautious optimism and open skepticism, with Quebec in particular signaling it was not ready to call this a win. And the broader structural tension driving this entire dispute, the unresolved fate of the CUSMA agreement itself, currently sitting in an annual review process after the United States declined to renew it outright the previous month, was not addressed by this deal at all. If anything, that unresolved question means the leverage Trump used to build these 50% tariffs in the first place, the Section 338 authority that had sat unused for nearly a century before this year, remains fully intact and available to be used again in a future dispute. The threat didn't lose its power so much as it got holstered, for now, with the option to be drawn again clearly still on the table. Before wrapping up, it's worth being transparent about exactly where every claim in this video came from and what remains genuinely uncertain. The details of the original 50% tariffs, their legal basis under Section 338, their effective date, and the specific product categories covered, come directly from the White House's own fact sheet, from trade law analysis published by firms including Blake's and GHY International, and from reporting by Al Jazeera, Time, and Yahoo Finance, all of which is consistent across sources. The alcohol export decline figures and the automobile purchase decline figures come directly from the language of the presidential proclamations themselves, as reported by International Trade and Supply Chain Insights and corroborated by Al Jazeera. The negotiation timeline through August, including Charette's private warning about a cliff moment, is sourced to the Globe and Mail's reporting, which itself relied on 5 sources described as briefed on the discussions, meaning it is credible and consistent with the public record, but not a document the public has independently verified. Carney's direct quotes, Trump's direct quotes, and Greer's direct quotes through the week of August 17 through 20 are drawn from CTV News, Bloomberg, CNBC, ABC News, the Canadian Press is carried by CP24 and BNN Bloomberg, and CBC News, all of which report the same core statements with only minor variation in framing. The Premier's individual reactions, including Eby, Moe, Frechette, Ford, and Houston, come from CP24's Live Updates coverage and BNN Bloomberg's reporting, both citing direct remarks to reporters. What remains genuinely unverified, and should be treated as such, is the precise final tariff rate on steel, aluminum, and autos, which multiple sources confirm is expected to drop, but which no outlet, as of this recording, has been able to report with a confirmed specific number. Trump's claim that Canada now imposes no tariffs on American goods anymore is also not corroborated by any other source, and should be treated as rhetorical overstatement rather than confirmed fact. And whether the alcohol bans are actually lifted across all provinces, following Carney's request to premiers, had not been confirmed province by province as of this recording either. What this story really captures, more than any single headline, is how trade negotiations at this level actually work in practice, messy, incremental, driven as much by political theater and truth social posts as by signed legal documents, with real economic consequences for real workers in Ottawa's federal offices, in Washington's trade negotiating rooms, and in factories and farms across both countries hanging in the balance the entire time. If you've been tracking this relationship since the fentanyl tariffs of early 2025, you already know how many times a deal has been declared, only for new friction to emerge weeks later. This may be different. The agricultural concession Trump described as specific and significant if it holds. The signals on steel, aluminum, and autos are consistent across multiple independent sources. But the honest, unglamorous truth is that nobody outside the negotiating rooms in Washington and Ottawa knows the final terms yet, because those terms don't fully exist yet. If stories like this one, where you need someone to actually read the proclamation text, track down the Premier's individual statements, and separate what a president claimed at a podium from what's actually been confirmed in writing, are useful to you, that's exactly the kind of coverage this channel is built around. And subscribing means you won't miss the moment. This deal either gets finalized in writing or falls apart the way so many done deals have before in this exact relationship. This negotiation is genuinely still live. The Saturday deadline Trump set is fast approaching as this video goes up, and whichever way it breaks, cutting through the spin on both sides of the border is going to matter more in the next few days than it has in months. So if you want that follow-up the moment there's real news instead of another press conference soundbite, hit subscribe now so it lands in front of you the second it happens. And because trade stories like this one tend to get buried fast under whatever the next news cycle brings, even though the actual economic consequences for workers and businesses play out over months, subscribing is genuinely the only reliable way to make sure you see the follow-up when Ottawa and Washington either sign this thing or watch it collapse. So here's the honest question worth sitting with. Trump has now used a nearly forgotten century-old law to build 50% leverage once, gotten a framework concession out of it, and left that same authority sitting fully loaded for the next dispute. Is that a Canadian negotiating win? Because a devastating tariff got paused and real concessions on agriculture, steel, aluminum, and autos appear to be on the table? Or is it simply a more sophisticated version of the same pressure campaign that's defined this entire relationship since early 2025, one where the threat never really has to be carried out to keep working? Let us know what you think the finalized text needs to include for this to count as a genuine Canadian win, and whether you believe Ottawa should have held out longer rather than asking premiers to restock American alcohol before the ink was even dry. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back the moment there's real news out of Washington or Ottawa on how this actually ends.